Good morning painters, and welcome back to the video series of my basic painting techniques, in which we have already reached the half with this fourth video. So there are still 4 others more to come. Today we are going to see several and varied examples of how I use the wash technique as a painting tool. I use this technique for 3 main functions that can be used at the same time or independent from each other: to shade, to give a color change or filter, to homogenize and give a common tone. In the dilutions video, we already saw the mixes of water and paint that I use, and now we will see a brief example of the brushes I normally use. Because it's a technique that needs an abundant lot of paint, I will normally use brushes of a large size, a number 2 or 3. As I usually don't need great precision with the brush, and I also use it roughly, it is not essential that the brush be of high quality. I generally use synthetic ones. Sometimes it's even very useful if the brush is a bit or even very open, since it allows a very fast distribution of the paint. For example, it's very useful for bases or very large surfaces. And after this introduction, let's go with the videos. We will start with a classic example of a wash to shade a surface or element, in this case a rusty cannon, on which we will apply diluted black paint. As it is an independent element and we are going to cover it completely, we apply the paint with the help of an old and worn out brush, but it allows us to load a lot of paint and distribute it quickly everywhere. And there is no need to be careful, since we do not have the risk of staining adjacent areas. In the picture we can see the before and after of 2 layers of black paint applied in the form washes, always allowing each layer to dry before applying the next one. In this example we are going to see a very typical error that is usually made when applying washes. In the same way as before, we load and apply a large amount of paint throughout the area of the clothes to give both shades and a purple tone filter. We can see how there's a large amount of paint applied, and that accumulates in different areas of the miniature, especially in holes and lower areas. This excessive accumulation, if not removed and allowed to dry normally, will result in little stains and dry paint lines. In the picture, we see how once the paint dries, you can see both the purple hue and the shading in many areas, which was the objective. However, we can also see the presence of the stains and lines in many parts, giving the feeling of a poorly finished work. To avoid the appearance of stains, we will see in this part how to solve the problem. Using the same dilution and paint color, we will apply it to this scheme, which is the result of an airbrush pre-lining. The idea is, once again, both to shade the base tone and to give it a different hue of color from the one it already has. Once the paint is applied in general and while it is still wet, it's very easy to remove the excesses using a clean brush. If the brush is properly unloaded, the paint will go up to the brush in small amounts instead of depositing, as if we were taking it from our palette. In the before and after photo, we see the shadow effect and color filter, but there are no traces of paint lines or stains. Now we can see a similar effect to make smooth transitions, more or less, in large areas, such terrain or bases. We apply a large amount of brown diluted paint in the areas that we most want to shade on the base, in its back half, near the trunk, in the same way as before. While the paint is still wet, and again with a clean brush, but this time with a certain amount of water, we can blur the limits of the deposited paint, both on the front and on the trunks. We can even add more paint to further accentuate the shadows, mixing the two consecutive washes. In the picture we see how, in the step of shading with washes, we can already create a transition that we can accentuate later. In the following example, there is already some differences from the previous ones. The brush is no longer that brush that styled everything around, it is pointier. But not much, it is still an old brush, but it allows us more control of where we put the paint. The tone is not a dark color to shade, but a saturated yellow. In fact, this time I'm not using paint, but ink, which has a high degree of pigmentation and not excessive coverage. This is because now the function of the wash is not to shade, but to give a color filter to a surface already worked. In this case, a gold that we need to look even more yellow. The form of application remains unchanged. We cover all the piece, the mechanical sphere in this case, distributing the paint over its entire surface and without allowing it to accumulate. In the before and after photos, you can clearly see the change in the gold tone of the sphere. Continuing with the previous example, we are going to do the same filter effect of color, and not to shadow, but this time on an already fully worked element, such as the weapon of the miniature. I use again ink instead of paint, because although I apply it with a high dilution degree, it keeps enough pigment to give a color filter that modifies the appearance of the weapon. I also use a brush that loads a lot of paint, a number 2, but with point good enough that allows me to apply the wash without staining the adjacent parts. In this tomb of the piece, you can clearly see the change in the tone of the weapon. Now we are going to observe an effect like the previous example, in which we will use a very light wash to change the appearance of a finished piece. The difference is that the piece, the front armor of an Elroi warrior, has numerous and relatively independent elements. The armor itself, the tentacle and the pustules, the damages, the cables, and I will try to create a general tone for the whole piece. With a couple of light purple washes on all the mentioned elements, a more integrated aspect of everything is achieved, although each part has its own colors, lights and contrast. This effect should be carried out in a subtle and not very aggressive way, so as not too much cover from all the work done. So, in the photos you can see that, despite being huge sums, the purple tone is very light. This last example, although it is the simplest, I have preferred to leave for the end, since it is the only one in which to do the wash I hardly dilute the paint. Here I directly apply an ink wash, which is something that I generally try to avoid, since despite having an optimal degree of liquidity to carry out washes, the amount of pigment is very high compared to what we have when we dilute the paint. For this reason, I only apply it to achieve certain effects, such as having modified the tone of elements in the early stages of painting, as we can see here, where we transform a base with a metallic tone into another one much more similar to bronze. Thus, I always recommend using washes with a significant degree of dilution, to try to control the effect of each wash layer that we give on the miniature. And so, we come to the end of this video, where I hope you have no doubts about how I use washes. As always, if you have enjoyed it, click the like button, share it, comment, and if you want to continue watching more similar contents, subscribe to the channel. See ya at the next stop, the blendings.